Welcome, dear listener, to another gentle journey through the shadows of history. Tonight, we invite you to settle back, perhaps pull a soft blanket closer, and allow your mind to drift into the smoky speakeasies and hidden distilleries of 1920s America. You are safe here, in your comfortable present, wrapped in the certainty of legal beverages and regulated commerce, as we explore a time when a simple glass of whiskey could cost you your freedom, your fortune, or even your life. Please consider subscribing to the channel and drop a comment below. Imagine yourself in the autumn of 1922, when the 18th Amendment had transformed the United States into a nation of criminals overnight. The morning mist clings to the Canadian border, and somewhere in the distance, the soft rumble of automobile engines cuts through the pre-dawn silence. These are not the sounds of early commuters or farmers heading to market, but rather the careful orchestration of men and women who have chosen to defy the law of the land for profit, principle, or simple survival. Tonight, we will walk alongside these forgotten figures of American history, feeling the weight of their choices and the constant tension that defined their daily existence. We will explore what it truly meant to live as a smuggler during Prohibition, when ordinary citizens became outlaws, and when the very act of quenching one's thirst became an act of rebellion against the federal government.
The story we unfold together will take us from the cramped quarters of rum runners' boats cutting through the dark waters of the Great Lakes to the elegant drawing rooms where society's elite sipped illegal cocktails behind closed doors. We will witness the transformation of America's relationship with alcohol, authority, and morality itself, all through the lens of those who chose to break the law that an entire nation struggled to understand. If you want to help me to keep doing these videos, please consider subscribing to the channel and hit the like button. It motivates and helps me keep bringing videos in this format. If you'd like to hear about a specific topic, leave a comment below, and I'll show you in the video when your topic is chosen. The alarm clock's metallic ring cuts through the darkness at 4 in the morning, but for Thomas McCarthy, sleep had been elusive anyway. The autumn wind rattles the windows of his modest boarding house room in Buffalo, New York, carrying with it the scent of Lake Erie and the promise of another dangerous day. Thomas rolls from his narrow bed, his joints protesting the cold that seems to seep through every crack in the old building's walls. At 32 years old, he moves with the careful deliberation of a man who has learned that survival depends on thinking 3 steps ahead of both the law and his competitors. The floorboards creak beneath his feet as he crosses to the wash basin, the sound seeming to echo through the thin walls where other men sleep fitfully, each harboring their own secrets and schemes. Thomas splashes cold water on his face, feeling the shock of it chase away the last vestiges of sleep. In the cracked mirror above the basin, his reflection shows a face that is aged beyond its years, marked by the constant stress of living outside the law. The lines around his eyes speak of nights spent watching for federal agents, of deals that went wrong, and of friends who simply disappeared without explanation. He dresses methodically in clothes that mark him as neither wealthy nor desperately poor, a calculated anonymity that has served him well in the 3 years since he began running Canadian whiskey across the border. His wool trousers are sturdy but unremarkable. His flannel shirt bears the honest stains of manual labor, and his boots are worn enough to suggest legitimacy, but not so deteriorated as to draw attention. Every article of clothing has been chosen with the same care a general might use in planning a military campaign, because in Thomas's world, the wrong shirt or an overly expensive watch could mean the difference between freedom and a federal penitentiary. The boarding house hallway stretches before him like a corridor of whispered secrets, lined with doors behind which other men prepare for their own dubious endeavors. Kowalski, the Polish widow who runs this establishment, asks no questions and expects no answers, understanding instinctively that her tenants' silence is worth more than their monthly rent. Thomas can hear the soft shuffle of feet in neighboring rooms, the gentle closing of doors, and the careful footsteps of men who have learned to move like shadows through the world.
This is the brotherhood of the desperate and the determined, bound together by their shared defiance of a law that has transformed ordinary Americans into criminals overnight. The kitchen downstairs smells of strong coffee and fried eggs, but Thomas knows better than to linger over breakfast. Mrs. Kowalski sets a plate before him without speaking, her weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency as she tends to the needs of men whose business she pretends not to understand. The eggs are fresh, the coffee bitter and black, and the silence between them comfortable in the way that only comes from mutual understanding. She has lost her husband to the war in Europe and her sons to the streets of Buffalo, and she knows that the men who rent her rooms walk the same thin line between survival and destruction that has claimed so many others. Thomas eats quickly, his mind already focused on the day ahead.
The Canadian contact will be waiting at the usual spot along the Niagara River, hidden among the abandoned warehouses that once served legitimate shipping companies before Prohibition transformed the border into a battlefield between smugglers and federal agents. The load today is substantial. 40 cases of genuine Scottish whiskey that will fetch enough money to keep him comfortable for the next month, provided everything goes according to plan. But in Thomas's experience, plans have a way of unraveling at the most inconvenient moments, usually when federal agents appear from unexpected directions. The morning air outside the boarding house carries the industrial smell of Buffalo's steel mills mixed with the fresher scent of the lake. Thomas pulls his coat closer against the October chill as he makes his way through streets that are just beginning to show signs of life. The city awakens slowly around him, with legitimate workers heading to factories and offices, while men like Thomas pursue their shadow economy in the margins of respectability. A milk wagon rattles past, its driver nodding a greeting that Thomas returns with careful neutrality, maintaining the fiction that he, too, is simply a working man beginning an honest day's labor. The walk to the warehouse district takes him through neighborhoods where the effects of Prohibition have carved deep divisions in the social fabric.
Some houses display the small signs that identify their owners as supporters of the temperance movement, while others show the subtle indicators known only to those in the trade. A particular arrangement of bottles in a window, a specific pattern of curtains, or a coded chalk mark on a doorpost. These silent communications form an invisible network that connects speakeasy operators, bootleggers, smugglers, and their countless customers in a web of mutual dependence and shared risk. Thomas passes a small Catholic church where early morning mass has already begun, the sound of hymns drifting through stained glass windows that filter the dawn light into jeweled patterns on the sidewalk. He thinks briefly of his mother's faith, of Sunday mornings in County Cork before the family emigrated to America in search of opportunities that seemed so much simpler then. The irony is not lost on him that Prohibition, ostensibly a moral crusade to purify American society, has instead created an entire class of criminals from men who might otherwise have lived quiet, law-abiding lives. The church bells toll the hour, marking another day in a decade that has redefined the relationship between citizen and state, between law and conscience. The warehouse district spreads before him like a graveyard of legitimate commerce, filled with buildings that once housed thriving businesses, but now serve as meeting places for transactions that cannot bear the light of day. Thomas moves carefully between the structures, his senses alert for any sign of surveillance or ambush.
Federal agents have become increasingly sophisticated in their methods, and what appears to be an abandoned building might conceal a team of Treasury Department operatives armed with Thompson submachine guns and arrest warrants. The knowledge that every transaction could be his last gives Thomas's movements a peculiar grace, the fluid motion of a man who has learned to dance with danger as a constant partner. He reaches the designated meeting point, a loading dock behind a warehouse that once processed grain shipments from the Midwest, but now stands empty except for the rats and the occasional smuggler's rendezvous. The Canadian contact is already there, a thin man with nervous eyes who goes by the name of Pierre, though Thomas suspects this is no more his real name than Thomas's own identity papers reflect his true history. They exchange the ritual greetings, the coded phrases that confirm each other's legitimacy in a world where federal agents have been known to pose as smugglers, and where betrayal can come from the most trusted associates. The whiskey sits in wooden crates marked as machine parts, their contents hidden beneath layers of legitimate documentation that would satisfy all but the most thorough inspection. Thomas examines one bottle in the pale morning light, noting the authentic labels and seals that mark this as genuine Scottish product, rather than the rot-gut alcohol that floods much of the illegal market.
Quality preems premium prices, but it also attracts the attention of federal agents who have learned to distinguish between small-time operations and the sophisticated networks that import the finest liquors from across the border. Every bottle represents not just profit, but also increased risk of detection and imprisonment. The loading process requires careful orchestration, with each man playing his role in a choreography perfected through months of repetition. Thomas's truck sits nearby, its engine idling quietly while steam rises from the exhaust pipe in the cold morning air. The vehicle itself is a study in calculated deception, powerful enough to outrun most police vehicles, but outwardly resembling nothing more than a common delivery truck. Hidden compartments built into the floor and walls can conceal enough liquor to supply several speakeasies, while the truck's legitimate cargo of automobile parts provides cover for the more valuable merchandise beneath. As the crates are loaded, Thomas maintains constant vigilance, his eyes scanning the surrounding buildings and his ears alert for any sound that might indicate approaching trouble. The work proceeds in near silence, broken only by the soft thud of wooden boxes and the occasional whispered instruction. Both men understand that their lives depend on efficiency and stealth, that every minute spent in the open increases the likelihood of discovery by federal agents who have made careers out of intercepting precisely these kinds of operations.
The morning fog provides some concealment, but Thomas knows that luck is a fickle ally in the smuggling business. With the loading complete, Thomas settles into the driver's seat of his truck, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. The route back into Buffalo has been carefully planned to avoid known federal checkpoints while staying clear of rival smugglers' territory. Other crews operate along the same corridors, and territorial disputes have been settled with violence that leaves bodies in the Niagara River and creates headlines that bring unwanted attention to the entire trade. Thomas starts the engine, listening carefully to its steady rhythm while his hands check the locations of the pistol beneath his seat and the emergency cash sewn into his jacket lining. The drive through the awakening city becomes a meditation on risk and reward, on the choices that have brought him to this point and the possibilities that lie ahead. Thomas knows that each successful run brings him closer to accumulating enough money to leave the smuggling business behind, perhaps to open a legitimate business in a city where his past remains unknown. But he also knows that each run increases the odds of capture, that the federal agents are learning and adapting just as quickly as the smugglers themselves.
The truck moves through Buffalo's streets like a shark through familiar waters, dangerous and efficient, but always vulnerable to the larger predators that patrol these same territories with the full authority of the federal government behind them. The truck's engine hums steadily as Thomas navigates the increasingly busy streets of Buffalo, each turn calculated to avoid the routes where federal agents are most likely to establish checkpoints. Behind him, secured beneath layers of legitimate cargo, 40 cases of Scottish whiskey represent more money than most working men see in a year, but also enough evidence to send him to federal prison for the better part of a decade. The weight of this knowledge settles into his bones like the October chill, a constant reminder that his freedom hangs by threads as thin as the morning mist now burning off under the strengthening sun. The city awakens around him in waves of activity that mirror the complex rhythms of legitimate and illegitimate commerce. Factory workers crowd onto streetcars, their lunch pails clutched in work-hardened hands as they head toward the steel mills and automobile plants that form the backbone of Buffalo's economy. Thomas watches them with a mixture of envy and contempt, envying their simple certainty about right and wrong,
while despising what he sees as their willingness to accept poverty in exchange for respectability.
These men work 12-hour shifts for wages that barely feed their families, while Thomas can make more in a single day than they earn in a month, provided he survives the experience to spend it. A police officer directing traffic at a busy intersection raises his hand to stop the flow of vehicles, and Thomas feels his heart rate quicken despite his outward calm. Local police present different challenges than federal agents. They are more familiar with the neighborhood patterns and personalities, but they are also more susceptible to corruption and more likely to look the other way for the right price. Thomas has cultivated relationships with several Buffalo policemen over the past 2 years, relationships built on envelopes of cash delivered with the regularity of seasonal tithes. But he also knows that political pressures and federal oversight can transform a friendly officer into an enemy overnight, making every encounter a careful negotiation between trust and suspicion. The officer waves him through with barely a glance, his attention focused on the larger flow of traffic rather than individual vehicles. Thomas nods politely, maintaining the facade of a working man going about his legitimate business, while his mind catalogs escape routes and contingency plans. The truck continues its journey through Buffalo's industrial heart, past smokestacks that pierce the morning sky like fingers reaching toward heaven, carrying with them the prayers of a city that has learned to find profit in the spaces between legal and illegal, moral and practical. His first stop lies in the warehouse district on the city's east side, where a speakeasy operator named Margaret O'Sullivan runs what appears to be a legitimate furniture store, but actually serves as a distribution center for some of Buffalo's most exclusive illegal establishments. Margaret greets Thomas at the loading dock behind her building, her graying hair pinned back in a practical bun, and her dress covered by an apron that bears the honest stains of furniture polish and sawdust. At 53, she has survived the transformation of American drinking culture by adapting more quickly than her competitors, understanding that Prohibition has created opportunities for those willing to embrace risk while maintaining the appearance of respectability. The furniture store's interior smells of wood stain and varnish, scents that help mask the more complex aromas of aged whiskey and gin that permeate the hidden sections of the building. Margaret's legitimate business provides perfect cover for her illegal activities. Furniture deliveries occur at all hours, large trucks arrive and depart regularly, and cash transactions are common enough to avoid attracting attention from bank investigators. Thomas helps unload 8 cases of the Scottish whiskey, each bottle destined for speakeasies that catered to Buffalo's wealthy elite, men and women who can afford to pay premium prices for genuine imported liquor rather than the harsh substitutes that satisfy less discriminating palates. Margaret examines one of the bottles with the practiced eye of someone who has learned to distinguish between authentic products and clever forgeries. The whiskey market has attracted counterfeiters who refill genuine bottles with inferior spirits, trading on brand recognition to deceive customers who lack the knowledge to identify the deception. She nods approvingly at the bottle's weight and color, at the authenticity of the label and the integrity of the seal, before counting out Thomas's payment in bills that smell of furniture polish and represent the first substantial profit of his day. The money disappears into various pockets of his clothing, distributed to minimize loss if he is robbed or arrested before completing his remaining deliveries. The transaction concludes with minimal conversation, both parties understanding that unnecessary words create unnecessary risks. Margaret returns to her legitimate customers, while Thomas prepares for his next delivery, the weight in his truck reduced, but the danger level remaining constant. Each stop brings him deeper into Buffalo's network of illegal commerce, a shadow economy that parallels the legitimate business district with its own customers, suppliers, and territorial boundaries. The speakeasy operators, bootleggers, and corrupt officials who populate this world have created their own version of American capitalism, one that operates according to market forces modified by the constant threat of violence and imprisonment. Thomas's next destination requires him to cross into Buffalo's Irish neighborhood, where his accent and appearance provide natural camouflage among the immigrant communities that have learned to view federal authority with suspicion and contempt. The Irish have brought their own traditions of resistance to unjust laws, traditions forged during centuries of British occupation and refined through generations of conflict with authority. Here, Thomas becomes simply another Irishman making his way in America, his illegal activities viewed not as criminal behavior, but as legitimate resistance to what many consider an illegitimate law imposed by Protestant temperance advocates who seek to control immigrant drinking customs. The neighborhood's narrow streets wind between tenement buildings, where families crowd into apartments that smell of boiling cabbage, coal smoke, and the accumulated hopes and disappointments of people seeking better lives in a new country. Children play in the streets despite the morning hour, their games interrupted periodically by the passage of delivery trucks and the occasional police patrol. Thomas recognizes many of the faces he passes, not as personal acquaintances, but as types he has encountered throughout his career in illegal commerce. The knowing looks of people who understand that survival sometimes requires breaking laws they had no voice in making. His customer here is Patrick Flynn, who operates a bakery that serves as a front for one of Buffalo's largest bootlegging operations. The bakery's ovens work around the clock, producing legitimate bread and pastries during business hours, while distilling industrial alcohol into more palatable forms during the night shift. The building's basement has been converted into a sophisticated production facility, complete with copper stills, aging barrels, and filtration systems that transform raw grain alcohol into products that can compete with genuine whiskey and gin. Patrick employs a dozen men in his illegal operation, paying wages that exceed what they could earn in legitimate work, while providing employment for Irish immigrants who might otherwise struggle to find jobs in a city where ethnic discrimination remains a persistent reality. The delivery to Patrick requires more careful choreography than the furniture store transaction, as the bakery's location on a busy street makes concealment more challenging. Thomas backs his truck up to the bakery's rear entrance, while Patrick's men create a screen of legitimate activity, unloading flour sacks and sugar barrels that mask the transfer of whiskey cases. The work proceeds with practiced efficiency, each man playing his role in a performance designed to appear routine to casual observers, while concealing the true nature of the cargo being moved. Steam from the bakery's ovens provides additional visual cover, while the sounds of legitimate baking operations help mask any noise created by the illegal transfer. Patrick inspects the whiskey with the same attention to detail that Margaret applied, but his examination focuses on different criteria. Where Margaret sought authenticity for her wealthy customers, Patrick evaluates the whiskey's potential for blending with his own distilled products, looking for characteristics that will enhance rather than compromise his reputation among Buffalo's working-class drinkers. He selects 12 cases for immediate use and arranges storage for the remaining bottles, which will be aged in his basement facility to increase their value and improve their taste. The payment he provides includes both cash and a selection of his own products, bottles that Thomas can sell to customers who prefer locally produced spirits to imported alternatives. The morning continues with additional stops throughout Buffalo's diverse neighborhoods, each requiring Thomas to adapt his approach to local customs and expectations. In the Polish district, he deals with Stanislaw Kowalski, a man who operates a combination grocery store and speakeasy that serves the neighborhood's factory workers. The transaction occurs in the store's back room, surrounded by sacks of flour and canned goods, while Polish folk music from a distant radio provides an incongruous soundtrack to the illegal commerce. Stanislaw's customers appreciate strong liquor at reasonable prices, caring less about sophisticated taste than about alcohol content and affordability. The whiskey Thomas delivers will be served in shot glasses alongside traditional Polish foods, creating combinations that would horrify Scottish distillers but satisfy men who work physically demanding jobs and seek simple pleasures at the end of long days. In the Italian section of the city, Thomas meets with Giuseppe Romano, whose restaurant serves as both a legitimate dining establishment and an illegal drinking club for Buffalo's Italian community.
Giuseppe has transformed his restaurant's wine cellar into a sophisticated storage facility, complete with temperature controls and security measures that rival those of legitimate businesses. The Italian community's winemaking traditions have provided natural expertise in alcohol production and distribution, making them formidable competitors in the bootlegging trade. Giuseppe examines each bottle of Scottish whiskey with the practiced eye of someone who understands that his customers will judge him harshly for any compromise in quality, and his approval carries weight throughout Buffalo's Italian neighborhoods.
As the morning progresses into early afternoon, Thomas finds himself navigating not just Buffalo's physical geography, but also its complex social and economic landscape. Each neighborhood presents different challenges and opportunities, different relationships between legal and illegal commerce, different attitudes toward federal authority and community loyalty. The truck grows lighter with each delivery, but Thomas's awareness of risk increases rather than diminishes, understanding that success in the smuggling business often breeds the overconfidence that leads to capture. Federal agents study the patterns of successful smugglers, learning to anticipate their routes and methods, turning consistency into vulnerability. The city's legitimate business district presents the greatest challenges for Thomas's final deliveries of the day. Here, federal agents maintain their most visible presence, understanding that the wealthy customers who frequent upscale speakeasies represent the most profitable targets for the illegal liquor trade. Office buildings and hotels provide cover for sophisticated drinking establishments that cater to businessmen, politicians, and professionals who can afford premium prices for superior products and elegant surroundings. These establishments require discreet delivery methods that avoid attracting attention from the federal agents who patrol these areas with particular intensity. Thomas's last customer of the morning is perhaps his most dangerous, a hotel manager named Charles Whitman, who operates an exclusive speakeasy in the basement of Buffalo's most prestigious hotel. The clientele includes federal judges, city officials, and prominent businessmen, creating a bizarre situation where the people responsible for enforcing prohibition laws drink alongside the criminals who violate them. Whitman pays the highest prices for the finest products, but he also represents the greatest risk of exposure to federal investigation. His customer list could destroy dozens of careers and send scores of people to federal prison, making him a prime target for federal agents seeking to make spectacular arrests that generate newspaper headlines and political support. The delivery to Whitman requires Thomas to enter the hotel through a service entrance, disguising himself as a legitimate supplier delivering goods to the hotel's kitchen. The transaction occurs in a storage room filled with hotel linens and cleaning supplies, the mundane surroundings providing stark contrast to the exclusive luxury that characterizes Whitman's illegal establishment. The whiskey will be served that evening to men who publicly support prohibition while privately enjoying the finest imported spirits, their hypocrisy protected by Whitman's discretion and Thomas's willingness to risk imprisonment for profit.
The payment reflects both the quality of the merchandise and the exclusivity of the clientele, completing Thomas's most profitable morning in recent memory while simultaneously increasing his exposure to the kind of federal investigation that could end his career permanently. The afternoon sun casts long shadows across Buffalo's streets as Thomas completes his final delivery, the empty truck feeling strangely light beneath him after carrying its illegal cargo through the city's labyrinthine network of speakeasies and distribution centers. The weight of cash in his various pockets represents more money than most honest men earn in 3 months, but Thomas has learned that counting profits before reaching safety is a luxury that dead smugglers can no longer afford. The federal agents who patrol these streets have developed sophisticated methods for tracking successful bootleggers, understanding that consistent profits create predictable patterns that can be exploited by patient investigators willing to watch, wait, and strike at precisely the right moment. His truck moves through Buffalo's changing landscape as the city transitions from the legitimate commerce of daylight hours to the shadow economy that emerges after darkness falls. Streetlights begin to flicker on despite the lingering daylight, their warm glow creating pools of illumination that will soon hide as much as they reveal.
Thomas has learned to read the subtle signs that indicate federal surveillance. The same face appearing in multiple locations, vehicles that maintain consistent distances behind him, the particular way that federal agents position themselves at street corners to observe without appearing to watch. Today, he has seen none of these warning signs, but experience has taught him that the absence of obvious surveillance often indicates the presence of more sophisticated observation methods. The boarding house where Thomas maintains his room sits in a neighborhood that occupies the uncertain territory between respectability and decay,
where working families struggle to maintain their dignity while surrounded by the temptations and dangers of illegal commerce. Children play in the streets with the particular intensity that comes from understanding that their games must end when darkness falls, when the streets become territory controlled by different rules and different people. Thomas parks his truck in the alley behind Mrs. Kowalski's establishment, backing it into a space that provides multiple escape routes should federal agents attempt to surround the building during the night hours when most arrests occur. Mrs. Kowalski greets him at the kitchen door with a plate of food that has been kept warm throughout the afternoon, understanding without being told that men in Thomas's profession maintain irregular schedules dictated by necessity rather than convenience.
The meal consists of beef stew, thick with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and coffee strong enough to cut through the fatigue that accumulates during days spent in constant vigilance. She asks no questions about his absence or his activities, maintaining the careful neutrality that has allowed her to provide sanctuary for men whose survival depends on finding places where their pasts remain unexamined and their futures undiscussed. The boarding house's common room fills with other tenants as evening approaches, men whose legitimate employment provides cover for various illegal activities that supplement their modest wages. There is Michael O'Brien, who works as a dock laborer during the day, but spends his evenings coordinating shipments of Canadian whiskey across Lake Erie. His hands bear the honest calluses of manual labor, but his eyes hold the calculating intelligence of someone who has learned to think several moves ahead of both competitors and law enforcement. Beside him sits Antonio Benedetti, who operates a small grocery store that serves as a front for numbers running and loan sharking, activities that provide the Italian community with alternatives to banks that discriminate against immigrants and traditional lenders who refuse to serve neighborhood residents. The conversation that flows around the common room's scarred wooden table operates in coded language that allows men to discuss their activities without admitting to specific crimes. References to shipments and deliveries could apply equally to legitimate goods and contraband liquor, while discussions of federal interest
and increased enforcement provide warnings about law enforcement activities without explicitly acknowledging illegal behavior. Thomas contributes to these conversations with careful precision, sharing information that helps ensure the collective survival of the group, while revealing nothing that could compromise his own operations should one of his fellow boarders fall into federal custody and face pressure to provide information about his associates. As darkness settles over Buffalo, the city's transformation from legitimate commerce to shadow economy accelerates with the urgency of a tide changing direction. Street corners that hosted fruit vendors and newspaper boys during daylight hours now become meeting places for bookmakers and confidence men who work the crowds emerging from legitimate businesses and seeking entertainment that cannot be found through legal channels. The sounds of the city change as well, with the industrial noise of daytime commerce giving way to the more subtle sounds of illegal activity. The quiet conversations of men conducting business that cannot bear scrutiny. The soft closing of doors that should remain locked, and the careful footsteps of people who have learned to move through the urban landscape without attracting unwanted attention. Thomas prepares for the evening portion of his work by changing clothes and adopting the identity of a man attending social functions rather than conducting illegal commerce. His evening persona requires different clothing, different mannerisms, and different speech patterns that allow him to move through Buffalo's upscale entertainment district where federal agents maintain constant surveillance.
The transformation involves more than simply changing shirts and combing his hair. It requires him to become a different person, complete with fabricated background story and carefully rehearsed explanations for his presence in places where Irish dock workers would normally attract immediate suspicion from both law enforcement and legitimate patrons. The speakeasy, where Thomas spends most evenings, occupies the basement of what appears to be a legitimate men's clothing store,
its entrance concealed behind a barber shop that operates normal business hours while providing cover for the illegal establishment below. The password changes weekly, and admission requires recognition by doormen who memorize faces rather than relying on membership cards that could serve as evidence in federal prosecutions. The descent into the speakeasy involves walking down wooden stairs that creak with each step, past walls decorated with photographs of boxing matches and horse races that provide acceptable topics of conversation for men whose real business cannot be discussed openly even in these protected spaces. The speakeasy's interior represents a careful balance between elegance and concealment, with furnishings elegant enough to satisfy customers willing to pay premium prices for illegal alcohol, but modest enough to avoid attracting attention from federal agents who monitor the movement of expensive goods into buildings that supposedly house only legitimate businesses.
The bar itself stretches along one wall of the basement room, its mirror reflecting bottles that display labels from Scotland, Ireland, and Canada, alongside locally produced spirits that attempt to replicate the taste of genuine imported products. The bartender, a man whose legitimate employment involves managing inventory for a downtown department store, possesses encyclopedic knowledge of his illegal inventory and can recommend specific products for customers whose tastes run toward particular regions or styles of whiskey. Thomas's evening routine involves more than simply consuming alcohol and socializing with fellow lawbreakers. It provides opportunities to gather intelligence about federal enforcement activities, to identify new customers for his smuggling services, and to maintain relationships with other members of Buffalo's illegal commerce network. Information flows through speakeasies like water through interconnected pipes, carrying news of arrests, warnings about increased federal surveillance, and opportunities for profitable collaboration between different branches of illegal activity. A conversation that begins with casual discussion of baseball scores might evolve into warnings about federal agents operating in specific neighborhoods, while seemingly innocent questions about someone's family back in Ireland could actually be requests for assistance in establishing new smuggling routes. The evening's entertainment includes not only drinking, but also gambling, with card games and dice that attract participants ranging from dock workers spending their weekly wages to businessmen risking sums that exceed most people's annual incomes.
Thomas participates selectively in these games, understanding that consistent winning attracts unwanted attention, while consistent losing creates financial pressures that lead to desperation and poor decision-making. The gambling provides additional opportunities to observe potential customers and competitors, to identify men whose financial situations might make them suitable for recruitment into various illegal enterprises, and to gather information about legitimate businesses that might serve as fronts for illegal activities. As the evening progresses, Thomas becomes aware of subtle changes in the speakeasy's atmosphere that suggest possible danger. Conversations become more guarded, with men glancing frequently toward the stairs that provide the only exit from the basement establishment. The bartender begins serving drinks with increased speed while simultaneously reducing the visibility of his most expensive bottles, actions that suggest he has received warnings about possible federal raids. Thomas recognizes these signs from previous experiences, understanding that successful survival in illegal commerce requires constant attention to environmental changes that might indicate approaching trouble from law enforcement or rival criminal organizations. The decision to leave the speakeasy involves careful timing and route planning, as federal agents often coordinate raids with street-level surveillance designed to capture customers as they attempt to flee raided establishments. Thomas waits for a natural break in the evening's activities, using a group of departing patrons as cover while he makes his way back through the barbershop and onto the street.
The walk back to his boarding house requires different precautions than his daytime activities, as federal agents operating at night often employ different tactics that take advantage of reduced visibility and smaller numbers of legitimate pedestrians who might witness arrests or other enforcement activities. The boarding house welcomes him with the familiar sounds and smells of working men settling into evening routines that provide brief respite from the pressures of both legitimate employment and illegal activities. Mrs. Kowalski has left a plate of food covered with a clean dish towel, understanding that men in Thomas's situation often find their dinner plans disrupted by circumstances beyond their control. The simple meal of cold meat, cheese, and bread represents more than sustenance. It symbolizes the domestic stability that provides psychological anchor for men whose professional lives involve constant uncertainty and danger. Thomas's room offers sanctuary where he can finally allow his guard to drop slightly, though complete relaxation remains impossible for someone whose survival depends on maintaining constant vigilance. The routine of preparing for bed involves securing the day's profits in hiding places distributed throughout his few possessions, ensuring that arrest or robbery cannot deprive him of all his earnings simultaneously. His clothes are arranged to allow rapid dressing should circumstances require immediate departure, while his few personal belongings are positioned to indicate whether anyone has searched his room during his absence.
Sleep comes fitfully to men in Thomas's profession, interrupted by street sounds that might indicate approaching danger and by dreams that replay the day's close calls with federal agents or rival smugglers. The consciousness that tomorrow will bring similar risks and similar opportunities creates a particular form of psychological pressure that accumulates over time, wearing away at mental reserves and creating the kind of chronic stress that ages men beyond their years. Yet Thomas continues because the alternatives, legitimate employment at wages that barely provide subsistence, or illegal activities that involve even greater risks of violence and imprisonment, seem less attractive than the dangerous prosperity he has achieved through whiskey smuggling. The night settles over Buffalo like a blanket that conceals as much as it protects, hiding the activities of both criminals and law enforcement officers who conduct their shadow war in the spaces between electric streetlights and behind the facades of businesses that serve multiple purposes. Thomas lies in his narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the city around him while calculating the risks and rewards that will shape tomorrow's decisions. Somewhere in the darkness, federal agents plan raids and compile evidence for prosecutions that could end careers and destroy lives, while smugglers like Thomas plan routes and evaluate opportunities that could provide either fortune or imprisonment, depending on countless variables that remain beyond their control.
As Thomas McCarthy settles into his restless sleep in Buffalo, 300 miles to the west, another man prepares for his own version of the dangerous dance that defines American life during Prohibition. Elliot Ness sits at his desk in the Federal Building in Chicago, surrounded by filing cabinets that contain the accumulated evidence of 3 years spent hunting the most sophisticated criminal organizations in American history. At 28 years old, Ness possesses the peculiar combination of idealism and pragmatism that has made him one of the Treasury Department's most effective agents. A man who believes simultaneously in the nobility of law enforcement and the necessity of bending rules to achieve justice in a world where traditional methods have proven inadequate against criminal enterprises that operate with the efficiency of major corporations. The office that serves as Ness's headquarters reflects the austere efficiency that characterizes federal law enforcement during an era when government resources must be stretched to cover responsibilities that expand faster than budgets or personnel. Metal filing cabinets line the walls, their contents organized with the methodical precision of a man who understands that successful prosecutions depend on documentation that can survive the scrutiny of defense attorneys who earn substantial fees by identifying procedural errors and constitutional violations. Maps of Chicago cover one wall, marked with colored pins that indicate the locations of breweries, distilleries, speakeasies, and distribution centers, creating a visual representation of Al Capone's empire that reveals patterns invisible to casual observation, but obvious to trained investigators who understand how to read the signs of organized criminal activity. Ness's personal appearance reflects careful attention to projecting federal authority while maintaining the approachability necessary for developing informants and conducting undercover operations. His suits are well-tailored but not expensive enough to suggest corruption, his shoes polished but not new enough to indicate excessive concern with luxury, and his manner professional but not so formal as to prevent the development of working relationships with police officers, prosecutors, and citizens whose cooperation proves essential to successful investigations. He has learned that effective federal agents must navigate carefully between projecting strength and avoiding the arrogance that alienates local law enforcement agencies, whose territorial knowledge and community connections often prove more valuable than federal resources and legal authority. The morning briefing that begins Ness's day involves reviewing overnight surveillance reports, analyzing financial records seized during previous raids, and coordinating activities with other federal agencies whose jurisdictions overlap in the complex legal landscape created by Prohibition enforcement. The Volstead Act has transformed the Treasury Department from a relatively straightforward tax collection agency into a law enforcement organization responsible for investigating activities that range from simple tax evasion to major conspiracy charges involving interstate commerce and federal racketeering statutes.
Ness and his colleagues have become experts in financial investigation, understanding that successful prosecution of major bootlegging operations requires following money trails through multiple banks, businesses, and jurisdictions, rather than simply arresting individuals caught in possession of illegal alcohol. The intelligence reports that flow across Ness's desk each morning reveal the sophisticated evolution of criminal organizations that have adapted to federal enforcement pressure by developing methods that rival legitimate businesses in their complexity and efficiency. Al Capone's organization employs accountants, lawyers, and business managers whose expertise in corporate finance and legal procedure often exceeds that of the federal agents attempting to investigate their activities. The bootlegging operations have developed their own intelligence networks, complete with informants in law enforcement agencies, corrupt officials in city and state government, and surveillance systems that monitor federal activities with the same systematic attention that Ness applies to monitoring criminal enterprises. Ness's approach to investigating major bootlegging operations involves building cases that can survive the sophisticated legal defenses employed by criminal organizations with unlimited resources and access to the finest legal representation available. This requires gathering evidence that meets the highest standards of constitutional procedure, while simultaneously developing prosecutorial strategies that can overcome the intimidation of witnesses, the corruption of local officials, and the technical legal challenges that defense attorneys use to delay and complicate federal prosecutions.
The work demands extraordinary attention to detail, as a single procedural error or constitutional violation can result in the dismissal of cases that represent years of investigative work and hundreds of thousands of dollars in federal resources. The selection and training of agents for Ness's special unit involves identifying men whose personal integrity and professional competence can withstand the enormous pressures created by criminal organizations willing to employ both bribery and violence to protect their operations. The Treasury Department has learned that traditional law enforcement methods prove inadequate against criminals who possess resources exceeding those of most legitimate businesses and who operate according to principles that prioritize efficiency and profit over legal or moral constraints. Ness has developed recruitment criteria that emphasize character assessment over traditional law enforcement experience, understanding that the unique challenges of prohibition enforcement require agents capable of maintaining ethical standards while working in an environment where corruption has become commonplace among local police and government officials. The daily routine of federal agents working under Ness's supervision involves activities that blur the traditional boundaries between investigation and intelligence gathering, between law enforcement and military operations. Surveillance of major bootlegging operations requires agents to maintain cover identities for weeks or months at a time, developing relationships with criminal associates while gathering evidence that can be used in federal prosecutions. The work demands extraordinary psychological resilience,
as agents must maintain their ethical commitments while operating in an environment where violence, corruption, and betrayal represent normal business practices rather than exceptional occurrences that shock the conscience of decent people. Ness's investigation of Al Capone's organization has revealed the extent to which Prohibition has transformed American criminal activity from individual lawbreaking into sophisticated enterprises that operate according to business principles adapted to illegal markets. Capone's brewing operations employ hundreds of workers, operate multiple facilities throughout the Chicago metropolitan area, and generate revenues that exceed those of many legitimate corporations. The organization maintains its own transportation network, complete with armored vehicles and professional drivers trained in evasive techniques designed to avoid federal interdiction efforts. Distribution systems rival those of legitimate businesses in their efficiency and geographic scope, while customer service operations ensure that speakeasy operators and individual consumers receive consistent products at competitive prices. The financial investigation that forms the backbone of Ness's case against Capone involves tracking money flows through legitimate businesses that serve as fronts for illegal activities, identifying bank accounts that handle revenues from bootlegging operations, and documenting expenditures that exceed any possible legitimate income sources. This requires developing expertise in accounting methods, banking procedures, and corporate finance that extends far beyond traditional law enforcement training. Ness has recruited agents with backgrounds in business and accounting, understanding that successful prosecution of major criminal organizations requires investigators who can match the sophisticated financial methods employed by their targets.
The coordination between federal agencies that characterizes Ness's investigative approach reflects recognition that Prohibition enforcement requires resources and expertise that exceed the capabilities of any single law enforcement organization. The Treasury Department provides financial investigation expertise and federal prosecutorial authority, while the Justice Department contributes legal resources and coordination with local prosecutors whose cooperation proves essential for successful prosecutions. The Bureau of Investigation offers intelligence gathering capabilities and investigative techniques adapted from its experience with federal crimes that cross state boundaries and involve interstate commerce violations that fall under federal jurisdiction rather than local law enforcement authority. The development of informants within criminal organizations requires Ness and his agents to navigate complex ethical territory where traditional law enforcement principles must be adapted to circumstances that the founders of American law enforcement never anticipated. Successful penetration of major bootlegging operations often requires agents to participate in illegal activities while gathering evidence, creating legal and moral dilemmas that challenge conventional understanding of appropriate law enforcement behavior. The Treasury Department has developed guidelines for undercover operations that attempt to balance investigative effectiveness against constitutional requirements and ethical standards, but these guidelines often prove inadequate when applied to situations where criminal organizations employ violence and intimidation as routine business practices. The pressure that criminal organizations apply to federal investigators includes both direct threats of violence and more subtle forms of intimidation that target agents' families and personal relationships.
Ness has learned that effective federal agents must develop security procedures that protect not only their official activities, but also their private lives, understanding that criminal organizations will exploit any vulnerability that might compromise investigative effectiveness or force agents to abandon cases that threaten criminal enterprises. This has required the development of security protocols that extend far beyond traditional law enforcement procedures, including measures that protect agents' identities, secure their communications, and ensure the safety of their families against retribution from criminal organizations with extensive resources and proven willingness to employ violence against law enforcement personnel. The technological resources available to federal agents during the Prohibition era require creative adaptation of existing equipment to investigative purposes that were never anticipated by their original designers. surveillance operations rely on photography equipment adapted from newspaper and commercial applications, while communication between agents employs telephone systems and radio equipment that provide limited security against interception by criminal organizations with their own technological capabilities. NES has pioneered the use of financial records analysis techniques that employ accounting methods adapted from business applications to criminal investigation, creating prosecutorial strategies that rely on documentary evidence rather than witness testimony that can be compromised through intimidation or corruption. The legal framework within which NES operates reflects the complex constitutional questions raised by prohibition enforcement, including issues related to search and seizure procedures, interstate commerce regulation, and federal versus state law enforcement authority.
The Volstead Act has created federal crimes in areas that were previously handled entirely by local law enforcement, requiring federal agents to develop expertise in legal procedures and constitutional requirements that extend far beyond traditional Treasury Department responsibilities. Successful prosecution of major bootlegging cases requires coordinating federal and local legal authorities while ensuring that evidence gathering meets constitutional standards that can survive appeals by defense attorneys with unlimited resources and extensive expertise in constitutional law. The psychological toll of investigating major criminal organizations affects federal agents in ways that traditional law enforcement training never addressed, as the constant threat of violence and the pervasive corruption that characterizes Prohibition-era law enforcement create stress levels that exceed those encountered in normal police work. NES has observed that effective agents must develop coping mechanisms that allow them to maintain their personal integrity while operating in an environment where ethical compromise has become commonplace among their colleagues and superiors. The work requires extraordinary commitment to abstract principles of justice and law enforcement that often seem inadequate when measured against the immediate realities of criminal violence and official corruption that define daily experience for federal agents working prohibition enforcement. The warehouse on Chicago's South Side stands like a monument to American industrial ambition, its brick facade and towering smokestacks speaking of legitimate enterprise and honest labor.
But as Elliot Ness positions his surveillance team in the pre-dawn darkness of November 1330, the building represents something far different, a brewing operation that produces thousands of gallons of illegal beer each week, generating profits that dwarf those of most legitimate businesses, while funding a criminal empire that has made Al Capone one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in America. The irony is not lost on Ness that this temple to criminal enterprise occupies a building that once housed a legitimate brewery, closed by prohibition and now reopened under criminal management that operates with greater efficiency and profitability than its law-abiding predecessor ever achieved. The months of preparation that have led to this moment reflect the methodical approach that Ness has developed for investigating criminal organizations whose resources and sophistication exceed those of most law enforcement agencies. The warehouse operation has been under surveillance for 6 months, with federal agents documenting delivery schedules, identifying key personnel, and mapping the distribution network that carries the brewery's products to hundreds of speakeasies throughout the Chicago metropolitan area. The investigation has required agents to adopt false identities, cultivate relationships with criminal associates, and gather evidence while maintaining cover that could be blown by a single careless word or suspicious action that might alert Capone's security network to federal interest in the operation. Ness's team of specially selected agents represents a careful balance between investigative experience and personal integrity, chosen for their ability to resist the corruption that has compromised so many law enforcement officials throughout Chicago's political and police establishments. Each man has undergone extensive background investigation that examines not only his professional qualifications, but also his personal finances, family relationships, and social connections that might create vulnerabilities to criminal influence. The nickname Untouchables has emerged from their reputation for refusing bribes and maintaining ethical standards in an environment where corruption has become so commonplace that honest law enforcement officers are regarded as curiosities rather than exemplars of professional behavior.
The tactical planning for the warehouse raid incorporates lessons learned from previous federal operations that failed due to inadequate coordination, insufficient resources, or advance warning provided to criminal organizations by corrupt officials within law enforcement agencies. NES has developed operational security procedures that limit knowledge of planned raids to essential personnel while creating multiple contingency plans that account for various forms of criminal resistance or unexpected complications. The timing of the raid has been coordinated with other federal operations designed to prevent Capone's organization from shifting resources or personnel to protect high-priority assets while law enforcement attention focuses on the brewery operation. The industrial neighborhood surrounding the target warehouse presents both advantages and challenges for federal agents attempting to conduct a surprise raid against a criminal operation that maintains its own security forces and intelligence network.
The legitimate businesses that operate nearby provide cover for surveillance activities, while their regular schedules of deliveries and shift changes offer opportunities to position federal agents without attracting attention from criminal lookouts. However, the same characteristics that make the location suitable for legitimate industry also make it ideal for criminal operations that require large-scale production facilities, transportation access, and the ability to blend illegal activities with the normal commercial life of an industrial district. As dawn breaks over Chicago, NES signals the beginning of an operation that represents months of investigative work and substantial federal resources committed to dismantling one component of Capone's criminal empire. The federal agents move with coordinated precision that reflects extensive training and careful rehearsal, understanding that their success depends not only on tactical execution, but also on their ability to gather evidence that will survive legal challenges from defense attorneys with unlimited resources and extensive expertise in constitutional law. Each agent carries specific responsibilities for securing evidence, controlling witnesses, and documenting criminal activities in ways that meet the rigorous standards required for federal prosecution of major criminal organizations. The brewery's interior reveals the sophisticated scale and efficiency that characterizes Capone's approach to illegal commerce, with production equipment that rivals legitimate breweries in its quality and output capacity.
The criminal organization has invested heavily in equipment that produces consistent quality products, understanding that customer satisfaction and repeat business require the same attention to production standards that legitimate businesses employ to build market share and maintain profitability in competitive markets. The workers arrested during the raid represent a cross-section of Chicago's working-class population. Men whose legitimate employment opportunities have been limited by economic conditions that make illegal work attractive despite its risks. Many possess technical skills acquired through experience in legitimate breweries before Prohibition closed legal production facilities, creating a pool of unemployed workers whose expertise made them valuable employees for criminal organizations, offering wages that exceed those available through legal employment. Their presence in the illegal brewery reflects the broader social and economic disruptions created by Prohibition, which has transformed skilled workers into criminals while creating economic incentives that reward illegal activity over honest labor. The financial records seized during the raid provide insights into the business operations of criminal organizations that employ accounting methods and financial controls that rival those of legitimate corporations. Capone's organization maintains detailed records of production costs, distribution expenses, and profit margins that reveal attention to business efficiency and market analysis that would impress legitimate business schools. The documentation includes payroll records for hundreds of employees, expense accounts for bribing officials, and profit distributions that demonstrate the enormous revenues generated by illegal alcohol production and distribution in a market created by federal prohibition of previously legal products.
The evidence collected during the warehouse raid represents only one component of a broader federal strategy designed to prosecute Capone's organization through financial crimes rather than direct evidence of bootlegging activities that prove difficult to establish beyond reasonable doubt in federal court. NES has learned that successful prosecution of major criminal figures requires building cases based on tax evasion and financial irregularities that can be documented through records and accounting analysis, rather than relying on witness testimony from criminal associates who face intimidation or violence if they cooperate with federal authorities. The approach represents a fundamental shift in law enforcement strategy,
treating criminal organizations as businesses subject to financial regulation rather than simply as collections of individual lawbreakers. The transportation network that serves the brewery operation reveals the sophisticated logistics that enable Capone's organization to distribute products throughout the Chicago metropolitan area while avoiding interdiction by law enforcement agencies. The criminal organization operates a fleet of vehicles that includes both ordinary delivery trucks, disguised as legitimate commercial vehicles, and armored cars designed to resist attack by rival criminal organizations or law enforcement officers. The drivers employed by the organization receive training in evasive driving techniques and defensive procedures that enable them to protect valuable cargo while navigating through urban territory that may be controlled by hostile criminal organizations or patrolled by law enforcement agencies seeking to interdict illegal shipments.
The security measures employed by Capone's organization to protect the brewery operation include both technological systems and human intelligence networks that monitor law enforcement activities and provide advance warning of potential raids or investigations. The criminal organization maintains informants within law enforcement agencies at federal, state, and local levels, creating intelligence capabilities that often exceed those available to legitimate law enforcement organizations. Communication systems employ coded language and secure telephone lines that make surveillance difficult for federal agents lacking the resources and technical expertise required to monitor criminal communications effectively. The political implications of federal enforcement activities against Capone's organization extend far beyond simple law enforcement, involving questions of federal versus state authority, constitutional limits on government power, and the effectiveness of prohibition as social policy. Local political leaders who benefit from the economic activity generated by illegal alcohol production often oppose federal enforcement efforts that threaten businesses employing thousands of workers and generating substantial tax revenues through legitimate business activities that serve as fronts for illegal operations. The complex relationships between criminal organizations, legitimate businesses, and political establishments create environments where federal agents must navigate carefully between law enforcement objectives and political realities that affect their ability to conduct investigations and prosecute cases successfully. The media attention that accompanies federal raids against high-profile criminal organizations creates both opportunities and challenges for law enforcement agencies seeking to build public support for prohibition enforcement while maintaining operational security for ongoing investigations.
Newspaper coverage of federal operations often provides valuable publicity that demonstrates government commitment to law enforcement while simultaneously alerting criminal organizations to federal capabilities and methods that could be exploited to avoid future enforcement efforts. Ness has learned to manage media relationships carefully, providing enough information to maintain public support for federal law enforcement while protecting investigative techniques and sources that require secrecy to remain effective against sophisticated criminal organizations. The legal proceedings that follow federal raids require coordination between Treasury Department investigators, Justice Department prosecutors, and federal courts whose dockets have become crowded with prohibition-related cases that strain judicial resources and create delays that benefit criminal defendants with resources to employ sophisticated legal representation. The complexity of financial crimes prosecutions requires prosecutors with expertise in accounting methods and business law that extends far beyond traditional criminal law experience, while defense attorneys employed by criminal organizations often possess superior resources and specialized knowledge that create significant challenges for federal prosecutors working with limited budgets and heavy caseloads. The international dimensions of bootlegging operations investigated by Ness's team reveal connections between American criminal organizations and suppliers in Canada, Mexico, and European countries that produce legitimate alcoholic beverages for export to countries where their importation remains legal. These international connections create jurisdictional complications that require coordination between federal law enforcement agencies and their counterparts in other nations, while also providing criminal organizations with supply sources that remain beyond the reach of American law enforcement authorities.
The global nature of alcohol markets means that prohibition enforcement must address not only domestic production and distribution, but also smuggling operations that cross international boundaries and involve diplomatic considerations that complicate purely legal approaches to criminal prosecution. The personal toll that extended investigation of major criminal organizations extracts from federal agents becomes evident in the relationships that develop between law enforcement officers who share the unique stresses and dangers of working against criminal enterprises with unlimited resources and proven willingness to employ violence against their opponents. Ness has observed that effective agents develop strong bonds with their colleagues while becoming increasingly isolated from civilian society that cannot understand the psychological pressures created by constant exposure to criminal violence and official corruption. The work requires extraordinary commitment to abstract principles of justice that often seem inadequate when measured against immediate realities of criminal power and political compromise that define the environment within which federal agents must operate. The technological innovations that emerge from prohibition enforcement include surveillance techniques, communication methods, and evidence-gathering procedures that will influence law enforcement practices long after the repeal of prohibition removes the specific legal framework that created the need for these capabilities. Ness and his colleagues have pioneered investigative methods that employ financial analysis, undercover operations, and coordinated multi-agency efforts that represent fundamental advances in law enforcement capability against sophisticated criminal organizations.
These innovations reflect adaptations to criminal enterprises that operate according to business principles and employ resources that exceed those traditionally available to law enforcement agencies, creating permanent changes in the relationship between criminal activity and government response that will shape American law enforcement throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The federal courthouse in Chicago stands as a monument to American jurisprudence, its classical columns and marble steps suggesting the timeless nature of justice and the enduring power of law to impose order upon chaos. But as Eliot Ness climbs those steps on a gray morning in October 1931, carrying briefcases filled with evidence that represents 3 years of dangerous investigation work, he understands that the building's impressive facade conceals a legal system struggling to adapt constitutional principles designed for a simpler era to the complex realities of criminal organizations that operate with the resources and sophistication of major corporations. The irony weighs upon him that Al Capone, who has orchestrated murders, corrupted officials, and terrorized entire neighborhoods, will likely be convicted not for these violent crimes, but for the mundane offense of failing to pay taxes on his illegal income. The prosecution of Capone represents a fundamental shift in American law enforcement strategy, demonstrating that criminal organizations previously considered beyond the reach of legal authority can be dismantled through patient application of financial investigation techniques that treat crime as a business subject to the same regulatory oversight that governs legitimate commerce.
Ness has learned that successful prosecution of major criminal figures requires abandoning traditional approaches that focus on specific criminal acts in favor of comprehensive analysis of financial patterns that reveal the scope and organization of criminal enterprises. The approach demands expertise in accounting methods, banking procedures, and corporate finance that extends far beyond conventional law enforcement training, creating new categories of federal agents whose weapons are ledger books and tax codes rather than guns and handcuffs. The evidence that Ness and his team have assembled against Capone fills dozens of filing cabinets and includes financial records seized from raids on breweries, distilleries, and speakeasies throughout the Chicago metropolitan area. The documentation reveals an organization that employs hundreds of workers, operates multiple production facilities, and generates revenues that exceed those of many legitimate corporations listed on major stock exchanges. The criminal enterprise maintains sophisticated accounting systems that track production costs, distribution expenses, and profit margins, with attention to detail that would impress business school professors, while simultaneously documenting bribes paid to officials, protection money provided to corrupt police officers, and expenses related to violent enforcement activities that maintain organizational discipline and territorial control. The federal prosecutors assigned to the Capone case have developed legal strategies that exploit the intersection between criminal law and tax regulation, understanding that the 16th Amendment's grant of federal taxation authority creates opportunities to prosecute criminal activities that might otherwise fall under state jurisdiction or prove difficult to establish beyond reasonable doubt in federal court.
The approach represents constitutional innovation that expands federal law enforcement authority into areas previously considered the exclusive domain of local police agencies, while simultaneously creating precedents that will influence criminal prosecution techniques long after the repeal of Prohibition removes the specific legal framework that made these innovations necessary. The jury selection process for Capone's trial reveals the extent to which criminal organizations have infiltrated Chicago's civic institutions, with potential jurors dismissed after investigation reveals financial connections to illegal alcohol businesses, family relationships with known criminals, or evidence of intimidation attempts by Capone's associates. The difficulty of finding impartial jurors reflects the broader corruption of Chicago's political and social institutions, where the enormous profits generated by illegal alcohol have created economic relationships that connect seemingly legitimate citizens to criminal enterprises through employment, investment, or simple consumer participation in illegal markets. The prosecution team must navigate carefully between ensuring fair trial procedures and protecting jurors from intimidation or corruption attempts by criminal organizations with unlimited resources and proven willingness to employ violence against their opponents. The courtroom proceedings that determine Capone's fate unfold against a backdrop of media attention that transforms the trial into a national spectacle, with newspaper reporters and photographers documenting every aspect of legal proceedings that have become symbolic of America's struggle to maintain law and order in an era when federal prohibition has created criminal opportunities unprecedented in the nation's history.
The coverage reflects public fascination with criminal figures who have achieved wealth and power that exceed those of legitimate business leaders, while simultaneously demonstrating the federal government's commitment to law enforcement despite the political and practical challenges created by prohibition policies that lack widespread public support. The defense strategy employed by Capone's attorneys demonstrates the sophisticated legal representation available to criminal organizations with unlimited financial resources, involving constitutional challenges to federal taxation authority, procedural objections to evidence-gathering methods, and character witnesses who testify to the defendant's contributions to Chicago's economy and charitable activities. The legal team includes some of Chicago's most prominent attorneys whose fees for defending Capone exceed the annual salaries of the federal prosecutors attempting to convict him, creating disparities in legal resources that highlight broader questions about equal justice under law in cases involving defendants with extraordinary wealth obtained through criminal activities. The testimony presented during the trial reveals the complex relationships between criminal organizations, legitimate businesses, and government officials that characterize Chicago's political economy during the Prohibition era. Witnesses describe a system where criminal enterprises provide employment for thousands of workers, generate tax revenues through legitimate business activities that serve as fronts for illegal operations, and maintain social services that supplement inadequate government programs for immigrant communities and working-class neighborhoods. The evidence demonstrates that Capone's organization has become integrated into Chicago's economic structure to an extent that makes its elimination potentially disruptive to legitimate business activities and employment opportunities for law-abiding citizens.
The federal agents who testify about their investigation work describe surveillance operations that required months of patient observation, undercover assignments that placed their lives at risk, and evidence-gathering techniques that pushed the boundaries of constitutional procedure while remaining within legal requirements that could survive appellate review. Ness's testimony reveals the personal costs of investigating major criminal organizations, including threats against his family, attempts to corrupt or intimidate him, and the psychological pressure of working in an environment where colleagues and superiors might be compromised by criminal influence. His account demonstrates the extraordinary commitment required for effective law enforcement against criminal enterprises that possess resources and capabilities that exceed those traditionally available to government agencies. The verdict that concludes Capone's trial represents both triumph and limitation for federal law enforcement efforts against organized crime, demonstrating that criminal leaders previously considered untouchable can be successfully prosecuted while simultaneously revealing the constraints that constitutional procedure and limited government resources place upon law enforcement activities. Capone's conviction on tax evasion charges results in a substantial prison sentence that removes him from active leadership of his criminal organization, but the enterprise continues to operate under new management that has learned from federal enforcement successes to develop more sophisticated methods of avoiding detection and prosecution. The broader implications of Capone's prosecution extend far beyond the fate of a single criminal leader, establishing legal precedents and investigative techniques that will influence American law enforcement throughout the remainder of the 20th century.
The case demonstrates that financial investigation methods can successfully penetrate criminal organizations that employ violence and corruption to protect themselves from traditional law enforcement approaches, while simultaneously revealing the resources and expertise required for such investigations that strain the capabilities of government agencies operating with limited budgets and personnel. The conviction establishes federal authority to prosecute criminal activities that cross state boundaries and involve interstate commerce, creating legal frameworks that will prove essential for addressing criminal enterprises that operate on national and international scales. The personal consequences of his victory against Capone weigh heavily upon Ness as he contemplates the costs and benefits of his law enforcement career, understanding that his success has made him a target for criminal retaliation, while simultaneously establishing his reputation as one of America's most effective federal agents. The constant threat of violence has affected his personal relationships and family life, creating isolation and stress that accompany the professional satisfaction of successful criminal prosecutions. He has learned that effective law enforcement against major criminal organizations requires personal sacrifices that extend far beyond the dangers faced during active investigations, including ongoing security concerns that affect every aspect of private life and social relationships. The organizational changes within federal law enforcement agencies that result from lessons learned during the investigation and prosecution of Capone's criminal empire include new training programs, enhanced coordination procedures, and technological innovations that improve the government's capability to address sophisticated criminal enterprises.
The Treasury Department has developed specialized units that focus on financial crimes investigation, while the Justice Department has created prosecution teams with expertise in complex criminal cases that involve multiple jurisdictions and require coordination between federal and local law enforcement agencies. These institutional innovations reflect recognition that traditional law enforcement methods prove inadequate against criminal organizations that employ business principles and possess resources that exceed those available to most government agencies. The political ramifications of successful federal prosecution efforts against major criminal organizations include increased congressional support for law enforcement budgets and expanded federal authority over criminal activities that were previously considered local responsibilities. The publicity generated by high-profile cases like Capone's trial demonstrates federal commitment to law enforcement while building public support for prohibition policies that have faced increasing criticism due to their social and economic costs. However, the success also reveals the enormous resources required for effective enforcement against sophisticated criminal enterprises, raising questions about the sustainability of prohibition policies that create criminal opportunities requiring such extensive government response to maintain legal authority. The international attention attracted by American law enforcement successes against organized crime influences prohibition policies and criminal justice systems in other nations that face similar challenges from criminal enterprises involved in illegal alcohol production and distribution. Foreign law enforcement agencies study American investigative techniques and legal procedures, while international cooperation in criminal investigations increases as governments recognize that criminal organizations often operate across national boundaries and require coordinated responses from multiple law enforcement jurisdictions.
The case establishes American leadership in developing innovative approaches to investigating and prosecuting sophisticated criminal enterprises that employ business methods and possess international connections. The legacy of Ness's work against Capone's organization continues to influence American law enforcement long after both men have passed from active participation in the continuing struggle between criminal enterprises and government authority. The investigative techniques pioneered during the Prohibition era become standard procedures for addressing organized crime, financial fraud, and other complex criminal activities that require specialized expertise and resources beyond those traditionally available to local law enforcement agencies. The legal precedents established through financial crimes prosecution create frameworks that enable federal authorities to address criminal activities that might otherwise prove difficult to prosecute under traditional criminal law approaches. The transformation of American law enforcement that results from Prohibition enforcement experiences includes not only technical innovations and legal precedents, but also fundamental changes in the relationship between federal and local government authority over criminal justice issues. The demonstrated effectiveness of federal agencies against criminal enterprises that exceed the capabilities of local law enforcement agencies create expectations for continued federal involvement in criminal justice issues that extend far beyond alcohol-related crimes. The institutional capacity developed during the Prohibition era provides foundations for federal law enforcement activities that will prove essential for addressing criminal challenges that emerge throughout the remainder of the 20th century and beyond.
As Ness reflects upon the completion of his most significant case, he understands that his success against Capone represents both the potential and the limitations of law enforcement in a democratic society that must balance individual rights against collective security, constitutional procedure against practical effectiveness, and limited government resources against criminal enterprises with unlimited financial capacity. The victory demonstrates that patient investigation and careful legal procedure can overcome criminal organization previously considered beyond the reach of legal authority, while simultaneously revealing the extraordinary commitment and resources required for such successes. The weight of these reflections settles upon him like the Chicago winter that approaches, cold and persistent, as he contemplates the continuing struggle between those who profit from illegal activities and those who dedicate their lives to maintaining the rule of law in American society. The forest floor along the shores of Lake Michigan whispers with secrets buried beneath decades of fallen leaves and accumulated soil, where the patient work of archaeologists and metal detector enthusiasts continues to reveal physical evidence of America's most ambitious social experiment and its unintended consequences. Dr. Sarah Mitchell kneels beside a carefully excavated depression in the sandy earth near Saugatuck, Michigan, her trained eyes examining fragments of brown glass that once contained Canadian whiskey smuggled across the lake during the height of Prohibition.
The bottles rest where they were hastily buried in 1929, when federal agents closed in on a smuggling operation that had successfully transported thousands of gallons of illegal alcohol from Ontario to Chicago's thirsty speakeasies. Their contents sacrificed to avoid imprisonment, but their physical remains preserved like artifacts from an ancient civilization for future generations to discover and interpret. The archaeological investigation of Prohibition sites represents a unique intersection of historical research and material culture analysis, where traditional excavation techniques designed for studying ancient civilizations must be adapted to examine relatively recent events that occurred within living memory, but left behind physical evidence that tells stories different from those preserved in official records and newspaper accounts. Mitchell's work along the Great Lakes shoreline has revealed a complex infrastructure of temporary facilities, hidden storage areas, and emergency disposal sites that demonstrate the sophisticated logistics required for successful alcohol smuggling operations during the 1920s and early 1930s. The physical evidence challenges romanticized popular narratives about bootleggers and rum runners, revealing instead a carefully organized system of supply chains, distribution networks, and risk management strategies that operated according to business principles adapted to illegal markets. The bottles recovered from Mitchell's excavation site represent more than simple containers for illegal alcohol. They serve as material documents that preserve information about international trade relationships, consumer preferences, and manufacturing techniques that operated parallel to legitimate commerce during the Prohibition era.
The glass fragments can be analyzed to determine their origins in Canadian, Scottish, or Irish distilleries, while labels and markings provide evidence of authentic products versus locally produced imitations that attempted to capitalize on established brand recognition in illegal markets. The bottles tell stories of global supply chains that connected Scottish Highlands to Chicago speakeasies, Canadian distilleries to New York nightclubs, and Mexican breweries to Texas border towns, creating international commerce networks that operated entirely outside legal regulatory frameworks. The methodology that Mitchell employs in investigating Prohibition archaeological sites combines traditional excavation techniques with modern analytical methods that can extract maximum information from fragmentary evidence. Ground-penetrating radar reveals the locations of buried caches and temporary structures that have been obscured by decades of natural processes, while chemical analysis of soil samples can detect traces of alcohol that soaked into the ground during hurried disposal operations. The work requires careful documentation of spatial relationships between artifacts, understanding that the specific locations where bottles were buried or equipment was abandoned can reveal important information about the operational procedures and security concerns that shaped smuggling activities during different phases of the Prohibition era. The network of caves, tunnels, and underground storage facilities that riddled the American landscape during Prohibition continues to yield archaeological discoveries that illuminate the scale and sophistication of illegal alcohol operations. Natural limestone caves along the Mississippi River served as ideal storage locations for aging whiskey and hiding inventory from federal agents, while artificial tunnels connected basements of legitimate businesses to create distribution systems that allowed speakeasy operators to receive shipments without exposure to street-level surveillance. The underground infrastructure required substantial investment in construction materials and labor, demonstrating that successful bootlegging operations possessed resources comparable to legitimate businesses while operating under constraints that demanded extraordinary attention to concealment and security. The rural farmhouses and abandoned buildings that served as temporary distillation sites and storage facilities have become treasure troves for archaeologists seeking to understand the decentralized nature of alcohol production during Prohibition. Mitchell's surveys of Michigan farmland have revealed the remains of improvised distillation equipment constructed from agricultural implements and household items, demonstrating the ingenuity that characterized small-scale alcohol production in areas where commercial distilleries were impractical or too visible to federal enforcement efforts. The archaeological evidence shows that Prohibition transformed ordinary farmers into part-time distillers, creating economic opportunities that supplemented agricultural income while requiring technical knowledge and security procedures that connected rural communities to urban criminal networks. The documentation that accompanies archaeological discoveries at Prohibition sites often includes personal items that provide intimate glimpses into the lives of people who participated in illegal alcohol trade.
Letters found in buried containers reveal family relationships strained by the dangers and moral ambiguities of bootlegging, while photographs preserve images of social gatherings where illegal alcohol consumption created bonds of shared risk and mutual dependence among participants. Personal possessions recovered from abandoned smuggling camps include items that suggest the temporary nature of many operations, with participants prepared to abandon equipment and supplies at the first sign of federal enforcement activity, prioritizing personal freedom over material investments in illegal enterprises.
The international dimensions of Prohibition-era smuggling become evident through archaeological evidence that reveals the geographic scope of supply networks that connected American consumers to producers in Canada, Mexico, and overseas locations where alcohol production remained legal. Shipping containers recovered from underwater archaeological sites in the Great Lakes preserve evidence of Canadian whiskey operations that employed legitimate transportation companies to move illegal products across international boundaries, while artifacts found along the Mexican border demonstrate the role of established smuggling routes that had previously been used for other contraband goods. The physical evidence shows that Prohibition created opportunities for international criminal organizations to establish permanent operations in American markets, laying foundations for organized crime networks that would persist long after alcohol became legal again. The technological innovations that emerge from archaeological investigation of Prohibition sites include communication equipment, transportation modifications, and concealment methods that demonstrate the rapid evolution of criminal enterprises in response to federal enforcement pressures.
Hidden compartments in automobiles reveal increasingly sophisticated engineering that balanced cargo capacity against detection risks, while communication devices found at smuggling operations show adaptation of legitimate business equipment to illegal purposes that required secure coordination between suppliers, transporters, and distributors. The technological evidence demonstrates that Prohibition enforcement created competitive pressures that drove innovation in criminal enterprises, producing methods and equipment that would influence illegal activities long after the specific circumstances of alcohol prohibition had ended. The cultural artifacts recovered from Prohibition archaeological sites reveal the social dimensions of illegal alcohol consumption, including items that demonstrate how speakeasy culture created new forms of entertainment and social interaction that challenged traditional gender roles and class boundaries. Decorative items found at excavated speakeasy locations show attention to creating elegant environments that attracted customers willing to pay premium prices for illegal alcohol served in sophisticated surroundings, while gaming equipment and musical instruments indicate that illegal drinking establishments served broader social functions that extended beyond simple alcohol sales. The material culture of speakeasies demonstrates how Prohibition inadvertently created spaces for social innovation and cultural experimentation that would influence American entertainment and nightlife throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The economic evidence preserved in Prohibition archaeological sites includes currency, accounting records, and business equipment that document the financial scale and organizational complexity of illegal alcohol operations.
Coins and bills found in buried caches reveal the enormous cash flows generated by bootlegging activities, while ledgers and record-keeping materials show that criminal enterprises employed sophisticated business methods to track inventory, manage personnel, and calculate profits in markets where traditional business practices had to be adapted to illegal circumstances. The financial artifacts demonstrate that Prohibition created shadow economies that paralleled legitimate commerce in scale and sophistication, while operating according to principles that prioritized secrecy and security over conventional business practices. The law enforcement artifacts discovered at Prohibition archaeological sites provide material evidence of the cat-and-mouse game between criminal enterprises and federal agents, including surveillance equipment, communication interception devices, and enforcement tools that reveal the technological arms race that characterized Prohibition enforcement. Equipment abandoned by federal agents during failed raids shows the limitations of government resources compared to criminal enterprises with unlimited budgets for acquiring superior technology and equipment. The law enforcement artifacts also demonstrate the evolution of federal investigative techniques in response to criminal innovations, creating technological development cycles that influenced American law enforcement practices long after Prohibition ended. The environmental impact of Prohibition activities becomes evident through archaeological investigation of sites where alcohol production and distribution created pollution and resource consumption patterns that differed significantly from legitimate industrial activities.
Soil contamination from improvised distillation operations reveals the environmental costs of prohibition policies that drove alcohol production into unregulated facilities where safety and environmental protection received minimal attention from operators focused primarily on avoiding detection by federal authorities.
The environmental evidence demonstrates that prohibition created ecological damage that persisted long after the illegal activities had ended, leaving contaminated sites that required expensive cleanup efforts decades later. The preservation challenges that affect prohibition archaeological sites reflect the relatively recent age of the materials involved and their exposure to environmental conditions that accelerate deterioration of organic materials and metal objects. Paper documents and wooden artifacts often survive only as fragments that require specialized conservation techniques to remain stable enough for analysis and display, while metal objects suffer from corrosion that can obscure identifying marks and decorative details that provide important information about their origins and uses. The preservation work requires resources and expertise that strain the budgets of museums and research institutions, creating competition for limited conservation resources between Prohibition-era artifacts and materials from earlier historical periods that are traditionally considered more significant for understanding American cultural development. The public interest in Prohibition archaeology reflects broader fascination with a historical period that combined familiar modern elements with exotic circumstances created by the unique experiment of constitutional prohibition. Museum exhibitions featuring Prohibition artifacts attract large audiences interested in seeing physical evidence of activities that seem simultaneously remote and contemporary, while metal detector enthusiasts and amateur archaeologists continue to search for buried caches and hidden facilities that might contain valuable or historically significant materials. The popular interest creates opportunities for public education about the complexities and consequences of prohibition policies, while also generating pressure for responsible archaeological practices that protect sites from damage caused by inexperienced treasure hunters seeking valuable artifacts rather than historical information. The interdisciplinary collaboration required for successful prohibition archaeology brings together historians, archaeologists, chemists, and materials scientists whose different areas of expertise contribute to comprehensive understanding of complex historical phenomena that cannot be fully interpreted through any single analytical approach. Chemical analysis of glass and metal artifacts reveals manufacturing techniques and geographic origins, while historical research provides context for understanding the significance of material discoveries within broader patterns of social and economic change during the Prohibition era. The collaborative approach demonstrates the value of combining traditional historical research methods with scientific analytical techniques to create more complete and accurate interpretations of past events and their continuing influence on contemporary American society. The waters of Lake Champlain hold secrets that modern sonar technology continues to reveal, as underwater archaeologists map the remains of boats that carried Canadian whiskey across the international border during the height of Prohibition, their wooden hulls now serving as artificial reefs that shelter fish populations while preserving evidence of smuggling operations that generated fortunes estimated in today's currency to exceed billions of dollars.
James Harrison adjusts his diving equipment on the research vessel Northern Explorer, preparing to examine a steamboat discovered in 2019 that appears to have been deliberately sunk with its cargo intact, creating an underwater time capsule that preserves not only physical artifacts, but also tantalizing clues about the ultimate fate of smuggling profits that disappeared during the chaotic final years of Prohibition, when changing legal circumstances and increased federal enforcement created dangerous conditions for criminal organizations that had grown complacent during the prosperous middle years of the 1920s. The mystery of the missing Prohibition fortunes represents one of the most intriguing unsolved puzzles in American criminal history, with historians and treasure hunters continuing to search for evidence of wealth that simply vanished when repeal eliminated the illegal markets that had generated unprecedented criminal profits throughout the previous decade.
Bank records from the period show enormous cash deposits that cannot be traced to legitimate business activities, while estate inventories of known bootleggers often reveal assets that represent only fractions of the revenues that law enforcement agencies documented during their investigations of major smuggling operations. The discrepancy between documented criminal revenues and recovered assets suggests that substantial sums were either successfully concealed in hiding places that remain undiscovered or transferred to foreign accounts that continue to generate interest for heirs who may be unaware of their inheritance from ancestors whose criminal activities were carefully concealed from family members and legitimate business associates.
The international dimensions of unsolved prohibition mysteries include questions about the ultimate destinations of American criminal profits that were invested in foreign businesses, real estate, and financial instruments that provided both security and anonymity for bootleggers seeking to legitimize their wealth while avoiding detection by federal tax investigators. Canadian banks maintained accounts for American customers whose deposits far exceeded any legitimate income sources, while Swiss financial institutions developed banking services specifically designed to accommodate American clients seeking to avoid federal oversight of their financial activities. The international money trails that connected American bootlegging profits to foreign investments created financial networks that influenced international commerce and banking practices throughout the remainder of the 20th century, while simultaneously creating mysteries about the ultimate disposition of wealth that may continue to generate income for institutions and individuals with no knowledge of its criminal origins. The technological mysteries that remain from the Prohibition era include engineering innovations and communication systems that were developed by criminal organizations but never documented in patent applications or technical literature that would preserve knowledge of their design principles and operational capabilities. Bootleggers pioneered modifications to automobiles that improved speed and carrying capacity while maintaining the appearance of legitimate commercial vehicles. But the specific techniques employed by the most successful smuggling operations were closely guarded secrets that died with their creators rather than being passed to subsequent generations of mechanics and engineers.
The communication technologies that enabled coordination between suppliers, transporters, and distributors often employed innovative applications of radio and telephone equipment, but the security requirements that governed their use prevented documentation that would allow modern historians and technologists to understand their capabilities and influence on legitimate communication development. The archaeological mysteries that continue to emerge from Prohibition sites include evidence of construction projects and infrastructure development that required substantial investment and sophisticated engineering, but left behind minimal documentation about their purposes and operational methods. Underground tunnels discovered beneath major cities often connect buildings in ways that suggest coordinated planning involving multiple property owners and substantial financial resources. But the absence of construction permits and architectural drawings makes it difficult to determine whether these facilities were built specifically for bootlegging operations or adapted from existing infrastructure for illegal purposes. The sophisticated ventilation systems, electrical installations, and water supplies found in hidden facilities demonstrate engineering expertise that exceeds what would be expected from improvised criminal operations, suggesting the involvement of professional contractors and skilled workers whose participation in illegal activities was never documented in official records. The genealogical mysteries that affect families whose ancestors participated in Prohibition activities often involve questions about the sources of wealth that enabled subsequent generations to achieve social and economic prominence that cannot be explained through documented legitimate business activities.
Family histories that attribute prosperity to successful investments or business ventures often lack supporting documentation that would verify the claimed sources of wealth, while estate records and tax filings from the period frequently show inconsistencies that suggest concealment of actual income sources. The social mobility experienced by many immigrant families during and after Prohibition created opportunities for upward economic movement that transformed their descendants into respected members of American society. But the criminal origins of family wealth often remained carefully concealed secrets that were passed down through oral traditions rather than written records.
The legal mysteries that persist from the Prohibition era include questions about the constitutional and procedural innovations that federal law enforcement agencies employed to investigate and prosecute criminal organizations whose resources and capabilities exceeded those traditionally encountered by government attorneys and investigators. Court records from major bootlegging prosecutions often contain references to investigatory techniques and evidence-gathering methods that are not fully explained in the official documentation. While appeals court decisions sometimes address procedural questions that suggest the use of novel law enforcement approaches that were not formally acknowledged in official police or prosecutorial guidelines. The legal precedents established during Prohibition prosecutions influenced American criminal law throughout the remainder of the 20th century. But the specific circumstances that created the need for legal innovations were often omitted from official records that might have revealed sensitive investigative methods or constitutional ambiguities that prosecutors preferred to avoid documenting.
The cultural mysteries of Prohibition include questions about the social and artistic movements that emerged from speakeasy culture, but left behind incomplete records of their development and influence on mainstream American society. Musical innovations that originated in illegal establishments often went unrecorded due to the secretive nature of speakeasy operations and the reluctance of legitimate recording companies to associate their products with illegal activities. While literary and artistic works that captured the atmosphere of Prohibition culture sometimes employed coded language or symbolic references that make their full meaning difficult to interpret without detailed knowledge of speakeasy customs and underground cultural practices. The cultural legacy of Prohibition includes influences on American entertainment, social customs, and artistic expression that continue to shape contemporary culture. But the underground nature of their origins makes it difficult to trace their development and assess their ultimate impact on American society. The geographic mysteries of Prohibition's smuggling routes include questions about the specific paths that connected Canadian suppliers to American markets, with traditional routes often modified or abandoned as federal enforcement efforts made established corridors too dangerous for continued use. Maps drawn by former bootleggers and federal agents sometimes show smuggling routes that appear to contradict geographic and logistical constraints, suggesting the use of transportation methods or intermediate storage facilities that were not documented in official records, but may have involved innovative solutions to the challenges of moving large quantities of illegal alcohol across difficult terrain while avoiding detection by law enforcement agencies.
The geographic knowledge possessed by successful smuggling operations often included detailed information about local geography, weather patterns, and law enforcement practices that was never formally recorded, but provided competitive advantages that determined success or failure in highly dangerous illegal enterprises. The economic mysteries that remain from Prohibition include questions about the actual profitability of illegal alcohol operations and the distribution of revenues among the various participants in smuggling and distribution networks. Official estimates of bootlegging profits often appear to be based on incomplete information about operational costs, taxation by criminal organizations, and the substantial expenses associated with maintaining security and avoiding law enforcement detection. The economic relationships between suppliers, transporters, distributors, and retail operators involved complex arrangements for sharing risks and profits that were never documented in formal contracts or business records, making it difficult to understand how illegal alcohol markets actually functioned, or to assess their influence on legitimate economic activities during the same period. The political mysteries of Prohibition enforcement include questions about the relationships between federal law enforcement agencies and local political organizations that often had conflicting interests regarding alcohol prohibition and its enforcement. Federal agents sometimes received cooperation from local police agencies, while simultaneously facing obstruction from the same organizations,
suggesting complex political arrangements that balanced federal legal requirements against local economic and social realities.
The political influence of criminal organizations on legitimate government operations often operated through intermediaries and informal channels that left minimal documentary evidence, while the corruption of government officials was accomplished through methods that avoided creating records that might be discovered by federal investigators or political opponents seeking to expose illegal relationships between criminal enterprises and government personnel. The social mysteries that persist from the Prohibition era include questions about the long-term psychological and cultural effects of living in a society where a substantial portion of the population regularly violated federal law while maintaining their status as respected members of their communities. The normalization of illegal behavior that characterized middle-class participation in prohibition violations may have influenced American attitudes toward legal authority and civic responsibility in ways that extended far beyond the specific issue of alcohol consumption, creating cultural changes that affected political participation, social organization, and individual moral decision-making throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The social legacy of Prohibition includes influences on American individualism, skepticism toward government authority, and emphasis on personal autonomy that continue to shape contemporary political and social debates. The medical mysteries that emerge from Prohibition include questions about the health effects of consuming illegal alcohol that was produced under unregulated conditions and often contained impurities or adulterants that created health risks unknown to consumers.
The absence of quality control in illegal alcohol production meant that consumers faced uncertain risks from products that might contain methanol, lead, or other toxic substances. While the secrecy surrounding illegal consumption made it difficult for medical professionals to study the health consequences of Prohibition-era drinking practices. The medical legacy of Prohibition includes both positive and negative health outcomes that influenced American public health policy and medical practice, but the illegal nature of alcohol consumption during the 1920s and early 1930s created gaps in medical knowledge that affected treatment approaches and prevention strategies for alcohol-related health problems. The environmental mysteries of Prohibition include questions about the ecological impact of illegal alcohol production and disposal, with improvised distillation operations often creating pollution and environmental damage that was never documented or remediated due to the secret nature of illegal activities. The disposal of contaminated materials from bootlegging operations may have created environmental hazards that persist in locations where illegal activities occurred, while the transportation of large quantities of alcohol created spill risks and contamination that affected soil and water resources in ways that were never formally studied or addressed by environmental protection agencies that did not exist during the Prohibition period. The environmental legacy of Prohibition may include contamination and ecological damage that continues to affect public health and environmental quality in areas where illegal alcohol operations were concentrated.
The technological legacy of Prohibition mysteries includes questions about innovations in communication, transportation, and security that were developed by criminal organizations but never formally documented or patented due to their illegal applications. The technological knowledge possessed by successful bootlegging operations often involved creative solutions to engineering challenges that required expertise comparable to that employed by legitimate businesses. But the secrecy requirements of illegal activities prevented the documentation and dissemination of technological innovations that might have influenced legitimate industry development. The technological mysteries of Prohibition include both specific engineering solutions and broader approaches to problem solving that may have influenced American technological development in ways that are difficult to trace due to the absence of formal records describing criminal technological innovations. The crystal chandelier suspended above the dining room of the Chicago mansion cast prismatic light across a table set with the finest Irish lace and sterling silver.
where Judge William Hartwell lifted a glass of genuine Scottish whiskey to toast another successful evening of what he privately called constitutional interpretation. The amber liquor had traveled from the Highlands of Scotland to the Canadian border, then across Lake Michigan in the hold of a yacht owned by his host, industrialist Charles Morrison, before arriving at this elegant gathering of federal judges, city officials, and prominent businessmen who publicly supported Prohibition while privately enjoying the finest imported spirits that money and influence could procure.
The irony that many of these men had voted for or enforced the very laws they now violated with casual regularity seemed to enhance rather than diminish their enjoyment of the evening's entertainment, as if the act of breaking their own rules provided additional flavor to liquor that already represented the pinnacle of distilling craftsmanship. 3 miles to the south, in a tenement building where immigrant families crowded into apartments that smelled of boiled cabbage and unwashed humanity, Maria Kowalski watches her husband Stefan convulse on their narrow bed as methanol poisoning slowly destroys his optic nerves and central nervous system. The bottle of whiskey he purchased from a neighborhood bootlegger for 50 cents contained industrial alcohol mixed with caramel coloring and flavoring agents that masked the harsh taste but could not eliminate the toxic effects of denatured ethanol that government regulations required be added to industrial alcohol to prevent its consumption. Stefan's weekly wages from the steel mill barely covered rent and food for their family of 6, leaving no money for the premium illegal alcohol that wealthy consumers could afford, forcing him to purchase whatever cheap substitutes were available from local dealers who cared more about profit margins than customer safety or product quality.
The contrast between elite and working class experiences during Prohibition represents one of the most striking examples of how social and economic inequality shaped the practical effects of federal policy, creating circumstances where the wealthy enjoyed better access to higher quality illegal alcohol than they had possessed to legal products before constitutional amendment transformed drinking from a social custom into a criminal activity. The Prohibition laws were written with democratic language that applied equally to all citizens, regardless of social class or economic status. But the practical enforcement and social consequences of alcohol prohibition created a system that reinforced existing inequalities while simultaneously creating new forms of social division based on access to safe, high-quality illegal products versus dangerous substitutes that threatened the health and lives of consumers who could not afford premium black market goods. The social clubs and private establishments that served Chicago's elite during Prohibition operated with a level of sophistication and security that rivaled the finest pre-Prohibition establishments, complete with professional bartenders who maintained extensive wine cellars and possessed encyclopedic knowledge of spirits from around the world. The Union Club's basement speakeasy featured leather armchairs, Persian rugs, and a mahogany bar that had been imported from a disbanded English gentlemen's club, while the staff included waiters trained in European service traditions and a chef whose cuisine complemented the finest French wines and aged Scottish whiskies.
The membership included federal judges who sentenced bootleggers to prison terms during the day and consumed illegal alcohol in elegant surroundings during the evening, creating a parallel universe where prohibition existed only as an abstract legal concept that applied to other people in other social circumstances. The working-class speakeasies that operated in immigrant neighborhoods throughout Chicago reflected the harsh economic realities that governed illegal alcohol access for people whose limited resources forced them to choose between food, rent, and the temporary escape that alcohol provided from the grinding poverty and dangerous working conditions that characterized industrial employment during the 1920s. The basement establishments that served factory workers and day laborers featured rough wooden tables,
dim electric lighting, and bartenders whose primary qualification was the ability to water down cheap alcohol without attracting customer complaints that might damage business relationships with suppliers who could easily find other retail outlets for their products. The atmosphere was often tense with the knowledge that federal raids could result in arrest and imprisonment for customers who could not afford the legal representation necessary to avoid conviction and sentencing. The quality differences between elite and working-class illegal alcohol reflected not only economic disparities, but also the sophisticated distribution networks that connected wealthy consumers to international suppliers, while working-class buyers depended on local production facilities that prioritized quantity and profit margins over safety and quality control.
The Scottish whiskey served at Judge Hartwell's dinner party had been aged for 12 years in oak barrels and transported under conditions that preserved its flavor and alcohol content, while the industrial alcohol consumed by Stefan Kowalski had been produced in a garage distillery using denatured ethanol, caramel coloring, and chemical flavoring agents that created a product that bore no resemblance to legitimate whiskey except for its intoxicating effects and potential for causing permanent physical damage or death. The medical consequences of class-based access to illegal alcohol became evident in hospital emergency rooms throughout American cities, where wealthy patients occasionally appeared with alcohol poisoning from consuming too much high-quality liquor, while working-class patients arrived with methanol poisoning, lead contamination, and other toxic effects from consuming industrial alcohol and homemade spirits produced under dangerous conditions by people with no knowledge of safe distillation practices. The physicians who treated these cases often found themselves in the paradoxical position of providing medical care for victims of federal policy while being prohibited from discussing the relationship between prohibition enforcement and the public health crisis created by unregulated alcohol production and distribution. The social rituals that surrounded elite alcohol consumption during Prohibition emphasized exclusivity, sophistication, and cultural refinement that distinguished wealthy lawbreakers from common criminals, creating elaborate justifications for illegal behavior that portrayed violation of Prohibition laws as expressions of cultural superiority and resistance to inappropriate government interference in personal choices.
The dinner parties, club meetings, and private gatherings where elite illegal drinking occurred featured elaborate social protocols that reinforced class distinctions while simultaneously creating bonds among participants based on shared participation in criminal activities. The conversations at these events often included discussions of constitutional law, individual rights, and the appropriate limits of government authority, creating intellectual frameworks that justified illegal behavior as principled resistance to unjust legislation. The working-class approach to illegal alcohol consumption was characterized by pragmatic acceptance of legal risks that seemed minor compared to the daily dangers of industrial employment, economic insecurity, and social marginalization that defined life for immigrants and laborers in American cities during the 1920s. The speakeasies that served working-class customers functioned primarily as social centers where men could gather after work to share information about employment opportunities, discuss labor organizing activities, and maintain cultural connections to their countries of origin through shared languages and traditional customs that were not welcome in mainstream American social institutions. The illegal drinking that occurred in these establishments was often secondary to other social functions that provided community support and cultural continuity for people whose lives were dominated by economic uncertainty and social isolation. The law enforcement approaches that police and federal agents employed in different social settings revealed systematic class bias that reflected broader patterns of discrimination in American criminal justice system during the Prohibition era.
Raids on elite establishments were typically conducted with advance warning that allowed prominent customers to avoid arrest and prosecution,
while raids on working-class speakeasies often involved violent confrontations that resulted in injuries, property damage, and mass arrests of customers who lacked the political connections and financial resources necessary to avoid conviction and imprisonment. The federal agents who conducted these raids understood that their careers depended on maintaining good relationships with influential political figures who might be found in elite illegal establishments, while working-class lawbreakers could be arrested and prosecuted without creating political complications for law enforcement agencies. The economic impact of prohibition on different social classes created opportunities for upward mobility among some criminal entrepreneurs, while simultaneously creating economic hardship for legitimate businesses and workers whose livelihoods depended on legal alcohol production and distribution. The wealthy individuals who invested in high-end smuggling operations often achieved enormous profits that allowed them to purchase legitimate businesses and establish respectable social positions, while working-class people who participated in illegal alcohol activities usually remained in dangerous, low-paying positions that offered minimal opportunity for economic advancement. The Prohibition economy created a parallel system of wealth distribution that reinforced existing class hierarchies while providing limited opportunities for ambitious individuals willing to accept extraordinary personal risks.
The cultural implications of class-divided illegal drinking included the development of different social attitudes toward law, authority, and civic responsibility that reflected the dramatically different experiences that wealthy and poor Americans had with prohibition enforcement and criminal justice system responses to illegal alcohol activities. Elite lawbreakers often developed sophisticated rationalizations for their criminal behavior that emphasized individual rights, constitutional principles, and resistance to government overreach, while working-class participants in illegal alcohol culture typically adopted more pragmatic attitudes that accepted law-breaking as necessary survival strategy in hostile social and economic environment. These different cultural approaches to illegal behavior influenced American political culture throughout the remainder of the 20th century, creating lasting divisions in attitudes toward government authority and individual responsibility. The family consequences of class-based prohibition enforcement created different patterns of social disruption that affected wealthy and poor Americans in dramatically different ways. Elite families who participated in illegal alcohol culture often experienced prohibition as an exciting social adventure that brought family members together in shared resistance to government restrictions, while working-class families faced constant threats of arrest, imprisonment, and economic catastrophe that could destroy family stability and economic security. The wives and children of wealthy bootleggers often enjoyed the material benefits of illegal alcohol profits while remaining insulated from the violence and legal consequences that characterized criminal enterprises, while the families of working-class participants in illegal alcohol activities lived with constant fear of police raids, criminal violence, and social stigma associated with criminal behavior.
The educational implications of Prohibition's class divisions included the development of different knowledge systems and skill sets that prepared wealthy and poor young people for dramatically different adult roles in American society. The children of elite families who grew up during Prohibition learned to navigate complex relationships between legal requirements and social expectations, developing skills in discretion, social networking, and risk management that would serve them well in business and professional careers. The children of working-class families who witnessed Prohibition's effects on their communities learned different lessons about the relationship between law and justice, often developing skepticism toward government authority and reliance on community solidarity that influenced their approaches to political participation and social organization throughout their adult lives. The morning light streaming through the stained glass windows of St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church illuminated the congregation of Chicago's most prominent families as they gathered for Sunday worship, their faces bearing the serene expressions of citizens whose consciences remained untroubled by the previous evening's violations of federal law. In the third pew sat Senator Harrison Montgomery, who had delivered impassioned speeches supporting Prohibition on the floor of Congress, while maintaining a private wine cellar that rivaled those of European nobility, its contents acquired through diplomatic pouches and international business relationships that placed his alcohol consumption beyond the reach of federal enforcement agencies. Beside him knelt his wife Catherine, whose charitable work with the Women's Christian Temperance Union provided moral cover for social gatherings where the finest French champagne flowed as freely as righteous indignation against the drinking habits of immigrant communities whose limited resources forced them to consume whatever dangerous substitutes they could afford. The theological gymnastics required to reconcile public moral positions with private behavior created elaborate systems of justification that allowed elite Americans to maintain their social respectability while participating in criminal activities that would have destroyed the reputations and economic prospects of working-class citizens caught in similar circumstances. The sermons delivered in fashionable Protestant churches often emphasized personal responsibility and moral rectitude, while carefully avoiding specific references to alcohol consumption that might discomfort congregations whose donations funded church operations and whose social connections provided access to political influence that protected religious institutions from government interference. The ministers who served wealthy congregations learned to navigate delicate relationships between moral instruction and social accommodation, developing theological interpretations that emphasized spiritual rather than legal definitions of righteousness. The private clubs that served as social centers for Chicago's elite during Prohibition operated according to membership rules and social protocols that created multiple layers of exclusivity based on family background, professional achievement, economic status, and personal connections to existing members who controlled access through elaborate voting procedures that maintained club homogeneity while excluding undesirable applicants.
The Chicago Club's membership included federal judges, prominent attorneys, business leaders, and political figures whose public positions required them to support Prohibition, while their private consumption of illegal alcohol occurred in paneled rooms decorated with oil portraits of distinguished ancestors who would have been horrified by the constitutional amendment that transformed their descendants into criminals. The club's wine committee maintained detailed records of vintage acquisitions and tasting notes that demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of international wine markets and aging techniques that exceeded the expertise of most professional sommeliers. The elaborate dinner parties that characterized elite social life during Prohibition featured menus designed by professional chefs who specialized in creating culinary experiences that complemented illegal alcoholic beverages imported from the finest producers in France, Scotland, and Ireland, with each course carefully selected to enhance the flavor characteristics of wines and spirits that cost more per bottle than working-class families spent on food in a month. The social rituals surrounding these gatherings included lengthy discussions of wine origins, aging processes, and vintage characteristics that demonstrated cultural sophistication while simultaneously celebrating successful violations of federal law. The conversations often included comparisons between current illegal acquisitions and pre-Prohibition collections, with participants lamenting the inconvenience of constitutional amendment while expressing confidence that political connections and financial resources would protect them from enforcement actions that threatened less fortunate citizens.
The domestic staff employed by wealthy families during Prohibition often included specialized personnel whose primary responsibilities involved maintaining illegal alcohol collections, coordinating shipments from international suppliers, and ensuring that social gatherings proceeded without attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies or temperance activists who might disrupt elite entertainment through embarrassing publicity or criminal complaints. The butlers, housekeepers, and personal secretaries who managed these activities received substantial compensation for their discretion and loyalty, understanding that their continued employment depended on maintaining absolute confidentiality about illegal activities that could destroy their employers' political careers and social positions. The household management skills required for successful elite lawbreaking included expertise in international shipping, customs procedures, and security measures that rivaled those employed by legitimate import businesses.
The educational institutions that served the children of elite families during Prohibition carefully balanced moral instruction with practical preparation for adult participation in social environments where illegal alcohol consumption represented normal rather than exceptional behavior. The private schools attended by wealthy children emphasized classical education, cultural refinement, and social graces that included knowledge of wine and spirits appreciation alongside traditional academic subjects, while carefully avoiding explicit instruction in illegal activities that might create legal liability for educational institutions. The informal education that occurred through family gatherings and social events provided wealthy young people with sophisticated understanding of risk management, social networking, and cultural codes that would serve them throughout their adult lives in business and professional environments, where success often depended on ability to navigate complex relationships between legal requirements and social expectations. The women of elite Chicago society during Prohibition occupied complex positions that required them to balance public support for moral reform movements with private participation in social activities that violated the very laws they claimed to support, creating elaborate systems of cognitive compartmentalization that allowed them to maintain psychological consistency while engaging in fundamentally contradictory behaviors. Catherine Montgomery's leadership in temperance organizations provided her with moral authority and social influence that complemented her husband's political career, while her private consumption of illegal alcohol occurred in social contexts that emphasized cultural sophistication and personal refinement rather than simple law-breaking. The social gatherings she hosted featured imported champagne served in crystal glasses inherited from European ancestors, creating associations between illegal drinking and family tradition that distinguished elite law-breaking from common criminal activity. The psychological impact of living double lives as public moral leaders and private criminals created complex personality adaptations among elite Americans who learned to compartmentalize their behavior and rationalize their contradictions through elaborate intellectual frameworks that distinguished their own civilized lawbreaking from the supposedly degraded criminal activity of less sophisticated lawbreakers.
The cognitive dissonance created by simultaneous public advocacy for prohibition and private violation of prohibition laws often resolved itself through social theories that emphasized class differences in drinking behavior, constitutional interpretations that questioned federal authority over personal behavior, and cultural arguments that celebrated European drinking traditions as superior to American puritanical restrictions. The psychological mechanisms that enabled elite hypocrisy during Prohibition influenced American upper-class culture throughout the remainder of the 20th century, creating patterns of moral reasoning and social behavior that continued to characterize wealthy Americans' approaches to law, authority, and personal responsibility. The economic analysis of elite illegal alcohol consumption reveals spending patterns and resource allocation decisions that demonstrate the extraordinary financial resources that wealthy Americans devoted to maintaining their illegal drinking habits while simultaneously supporting political candidates and advocacy organizations that promoted prohibition enforcement. The amounts spent by individual wealthy families on illegal alcohol often exceeded the annual incomes of working-class families, while the collective spending by elite consumers created market demand that sustained sophisticated international smuggling networks and domestic distribution systems that employed thousands of workers and generated revenues comparable to major legitimate industries. The economic impact of elite illegal spending extended far beyond direct alcohol purchases to include related expenses for entertainment, security, legal representation, and political influence that created complex webs of economic activity centered around criminal enterprises that served wealthy customers.
The gray December morning in 1933 that witnessed the ratification of the 21st Amendment brought relief to millions of Americans. But the celebrations that erupted across the nation could not erase the 13 years of social division, economic disruption, and cultural transformation that had permanently altered the relationship between American citizens and their government. In the elegant drawing rooms of Chicago's elite neighborhoods, champagne toasts marked the end of an inconvenient but profitable era, while in the tenement districts,
where methanol poisoning had claimed thousands of lives, working families mourned relatives whose deaths had been caused not by alcohol itself, but by the toxic substitutes that prohibition policies had forced them to consume. The repeal of constitutional prohibition restored the legal right to drink, but it could not repair the social fabric that had been torn by 13 years of systematic inequality in law enforcement, criminal justice, and access to safe consumer products. The statistical analysis of prohibition's human costs reveals disparities that reflect the broader patterns of social and economic inequality that characterized American society during the 1920s and early 1930s. Federal health records from major cities show that deaths from methanol poisoning occurred almost exclusively in working-class neighborhoods, while hospital admissions for alcohol-related injuries in wealthy districts typically involved accidents or overconsumption of high-quality liquor, rather than toxic poisoning from industrial alcohol.
The mortality statistics demonstrate that Prohibition killed far more working-class Americans through poisoning than it saved through reduced alcohol consumption, while wealthy Americans, who could afford premium illegal alcohol, experienced health outcomes that were often better than those they had enjoyed during the pre-Prohibition era when they consumed larger quantities of legal but sometimes adulterated commercial products. The economic legacy of Prohibition includes both the fortunes created through illegal activities and the legitimate businesses destroyed by constitutional amendment that eliminated entire industries overnight, while creating opportunities for criminal enterprises that operated without regulatory oversight or taxation. The breweries, distilleries, and related businesses that employed hundreds of thousands of American workers before 1920 either closed permanently or converted to other products, creating unemployment and economic disruption that particularly affected immigrant communities where alcohol production had provided stable employment for skilled workers. The criminal enterprises that replaced legitimate alcohol businesses generated enormous profits for successful operators, while creating few stable employment opportunities and contributing nothing to government revenues through taxation, creating economic distortions that affected American business and finance throughout the Prohibition period. The social mobility patterns that emerged during Prohibition reveal complex relationships between criminal activity and legitimate success, with some participants in illegal alcohol enterprises using their profits to establish respectable businesses and achieve social prominence, while others found themselves trapped in criminal careers that offered high short-term profits but limited opportunities for legitimate advancement.
The wealthy Americans who invested in high-end smuggling operations often used their illegal profits to expand legitimate business interests, creating mixed portfolios that combined criminal and legal income sources in ways that provided both respectability and protection from prosecution. The working-class participants in illegal alcohol activities typically remained in dangerous, low-paying positions that offered minimal opportunity for economic advancement while facing constant risks of arrest, violence, and health problems from consuming dangerous alcohol substitutes. The institutional changes that resulted from Prohibition enforcement included permanent expansions of federal law enforcement authority, new approaches to constitutional interpretation, and modified relationships between federal and state governments that influenced American legal and political systems throughout the remainder of the 20th century. The investigative techniques pioneered by federal agents like Eliot Ness became standard procedures for addressing organized crime and white-collar criminal activity, while the legal precedents established through Prohibition prosecutions created frameworks for federal intervention in criminal activities that had previously been considered state and local responsibilities. The constitutional questions raised by Prohibition enforcement contributed to ongoing debates about federal authority, individual rights, and the appropriate limits of government power that continue to influence American political discourse. The cultural transformations that accompanied Prohibition included changes in American attitudes toward law, authority, and personal responsibility that reflected the complex moral environment created when a substantial portion of the population regularly violated federal law while maintaining their status as respectable citizens.
The normalization of lawbreaking that characterized middle-class participation in prohibition violations created cultural precedents for selective compliance with government regulations, while the enforcement disparities that protected wealthy lawbreakers while punishing working-class criminals reinforced cynicism about equal justice under law. The cultural legacy of prohibition includes both positive innovations in entertainment, social interaction, and artistic expression, and negative consequences including increased tolerance for government corruption and weakened respect for legal authority among citizens who witnessed systematic inequality in law enforcement. The educational implications of prohibition included both formal changes in curricula and informal learning experiences that shaped the knowledge, skills, and attitudes of Americans who came of age during the 1920s and early 1930s. The generation that experienced prohibition during their formative years learned to navigate complex relationships between legal requirements and social expectations, developing skills in risk assessment, moral reasoning, and cultural adaptation that differed significantly from those acquired by previous generations. The informal education that occurred in speakeasies and other illegal establishments exposed young people to diverse cultural traditions, musical styles, and social customs that contributed to the cosmopolitan outlook and cultural sophistication that characterized the generation that inherited leadership responsibilities as prohibition ended. As we consider the final implications of America's great experiment with constitutional prohibition, the lasting lesson seems to be that laws cannot successfully regulate behavior that lacks widespread social support, while enforcement efforts that create systematic inequality based on wealth and social status undermine the moral authority of government institutions and legal systems.
The 13 years of prohibition demonstrated both the power and the limitations of federal authority in a democratic society, showing that government can temporarily change behavior through legal coercion, but cannot permanently alter cultural patterns and social customs without addressing the underlying economic and social conditions that shape individual choices and community values. The legacy of prohibition continues to influence American debates about drug policy, government regulation, and personal freedom, providing historical examples that inform contemporary discussions about the appropriate balance between individual liberty and collective welfare in a diverse democratic society.